Airports are always bustling and tense places. Suitcases rolling on the floor, phones ringing, and the hurried conversations of passengers. But today the atmosphere here is different. Among the crowd, there is a man in military uniform, walking steadily with silent steps. But his expression is not the calmness of a routine business trip. Colonel James Miller, a senior officer, walks in with a sacred mission: to bring the remains of Private First Class Jason Reynolds, a young soldier who died at the age of 21, back to his family. In this moment, all the medals on his chest are not only symbols of courage, but also a heavy responsibility that he carries. But no one expected that a task that seemed so simple would be challenged right here. As he approached the check-in counter and presented his documents, the clerk looked at him with indifference, showing no regard for what he was carrying. Miller handed over the valid paperwork, but immediately, an unexpected response from the airline staff made him stop. "Sorry, sir. There's an issue with your ticket. You cannot board the flight at this time." This refusal was not just a minor incident, it was an insult. Colonel James Miller stood firm, his gaze locked onto the airline employee in front of him, while the noise of the airport around him seemed to fade away. Today was not an ordinary day. Today he carried a special mission, and nothing would make him falter. But when the airline staff gave a strange response about security policies, Miller knew something was wrong. He had carried out this mission hundreds of times before, bringing his comrades home from fierce battlefields, and had never faced a refusal like this. Despite the briefcase in his hand, containing valid military documents, he felt as though he was standing in front of an invisible wall. The eyes of passengers around him turned toward him, but no one seemed to care about his situation. Instead of speaking up in support, people merely passed by, engrossed in their phones or their own matters. But he could not give up. His goal was to bring the remains of Private First Class Jason Reynolds, a 21-year-old soldier, back home. That mattered more than any flight. "Ma'am, I am on a military mission," he said calmly, keeping his voice steady. "My papers are entirely in order. I need to board this flight." The airline employee nodded vaguely, glanced at her computer, and typed something quickly. But only a few seconds later, she looked up and shook her head. "Sorry, sir, but we cannot accept your ticket at this time. It's a security policy." Miller tried to remain calm, but deep inside, frustration began to rise. He had faced thousands of political conversations, fought through the harshest situations, but now he felt like he was being blocked by an unreasonable injustice. Colonel Miller adjusted his cap, trying to stay calm as he saw the airline employee continue typing on her computer, completely ignoring him. The people around him remained absorbed in their own tasks, but Miller could clearly feel the shift in the air. He wasn't just standing at the check-in counter. He was facing an injustice that he could not ignore. "Ma'am," he said gently but firmly, "I am on a military mission. I have presented valid documents." He handed the papers to the employee again, but she merely glanced at them without any sign of surprise or concern. Miller recognized the lack of respect in her gaze. The employee didn't respond immediately. She just kept typing on the keyboard, then repeated her earlier statement, as if it were a rehearsed response. "I'm sorry, but security policy doesn't allow us to do that," she said, not looking at him, her expression blank. Though patient, Miller felt his frustration starting to rise. He had fought in fierce battles, faced enemies on the battlefield. But now, he felt deeply insulted by the unreasonable policy of an airline. "Does this policy apply to people on military duty?" Miller asked, maintaining his calm but resolute tone. The airline employee looked at him, her eyes never leaving the screen. Yes, this policy applies to all passengers. She continued typing, as though she didn't even care that a man in uniform, carrying a sacred duty, was standing before her. This indifference only made Miller more irritated. He slowly explained, "I'm not on vacation. This is a military mission. I need to board this flight to bring the remains of a soldier home. You can't deny me like this." Despite Miller's clear and complete explanation, the employee didn't respond right away. She simply shook her head, her gaze still glued to the computer screen, as though he weren't a human being with emotions or needs, but just someone waiting. Meanwhile, the passengers around began to notice the situation. A woman standing near the counter gently asked, "I see he's on a military mission, is that right? Why can't he board the flight?" Her question caught the attention of the people around. A few began to follow the story. The airline employee paused briefly, then replied, with a detached attitude, "It's a security policy. We can't do anything about it." Her voice started to sound more irritable, as though she was tired of Miller's questions and the growing inquiries from the other passengers. But Miller wouldn't stop demanding to board the flight. He had fought through too many struggles to let something as absurd as this slide. "I don't understand why I'm being denied. I've flown on military flights before, and I know the process. This is not a security issue." The employee glanced at him once more, seemingly trying to come up with a more convincing response. But she couldn't, and at that moment, Miller realized that all this was just an excuse, a way to avoid responsibility for a wrong decision. Just then, a man from the line of passengers stepped forward. He wore an old military cap, a veteran. He looked directly at the employee and said firmly, "We're talking about a soldier on duty, not someone going on vacation. This is an insult." His words charged the air with tension. All eyes turned toward the employee, and the veteran continued in a resolute voice, "I've flown many times, and I've never seen anything like this." The airline employee's expression remained unchanged. She nodded and tiredly said, "Sorry, but this is the procedure and we can't change it." However, the chaos had already begun. Passengers around started criticizing the employee, and some pulled out their phones to record the incident. Whispers became more distinct. "He's a soldier! He deserves respect," one man in the crowd said. Conversations among the passengers began to grow louder, and they started speaking up. Meanwhile, Miller stood tall, without a hint of concern, just patiently waiting. He knew he would not back down. Every word from him reflected his determination. "I'm not leaving here until I understand the real reason why I can't board this flight." And at that moment, it wasn't just a personal struggle for him. It was a fight for respect and justice, for the rights of every soldier. The silence in the air began to shift into tension and discomfort. Colonel Miller stood still, his hand firmly placed on the counter, his eyes never leaving the airline employee. From behind him, a deep sigh was heard, and a middle-aged man with silver hair, wearing an old military cap, stepped forward. He looked directly at the clerk and spoke clearly and assertively. "We're talking about a soldier on duty. What are you all doing?" Miller felt the support from this veteran like a huge source of encouragement. They stood side by side, two generations of soldiers, sharing a common goal, despite their different circumstances. The veteran continued, his voice full of strength, not weakness. "We cannot let a soldier be made to wait and be turned away like this. This is unacceptable." The airline employee began to show signs of discomfort, her gaze flickering briefly toward her colleagues, who were watching from afar. But she remained stubborn, replying wearily as if she had already repeated this too many times. "There's nothing we can do because this is company policy." She turned back to her computer screen, her fingers tapping the keys decisively, as though she were searching for some reason to continue the conversation. But no one present believed her reasoning anymore. The veteran wouldn't relent. "You can't say that. He's not just a regular customer. He's on duty, bringing the remains of a fallen comrade home. Do you understand that?" He stared at the employee, his expression resolute. Miller didn't say anything more, but inside his patience was beginning to fracture. He had fought through countless hours of combat, faced enemies in the most dangerous situations. But now, he felt like he was being forced to fight against something invisible and senseless. The chaos seemed to spread. A few passengers standing around began to join the conversation. A young man, messy-haired and wearing a hoodie, pulled out his phone and started recording the incident. "What's going on here? Why can't he board? He's on a mission, not on vacation," he said, looking directly at the employee. A few others exchanged glances and began pulling out their phones to record. A woman nearby, wearing a red coat, approached and spoke up. Though her voice wasn't loud, it was clear. "He's a soldier, and he's bringing the body of another soldier home. How can you refuse him? Do the right thing." And she turned to a passenger nearby and continued, "We can't let this happen without doing something." The airline employee still didn't respond clearly. She just looked down at her keyboard, her hands trembling, perhaps nervous now that more people were paying attention and recording the incident. The situation had spiraled beyond her control, and her colleagues were watching from a distance. The tension in the crowd grew as whispers began to rise. Some passengers turned to each other, murmuring in disbelief, "This is unbelievable! He's an army officer! Why treat him like this?" A man in a black suit shook his head as he looked at the clerk. "What are you all doing? This is an insult." The anger in the crowd continued to mount. Those witnessing the situation began to draw others' attention. A middle-aged man in a dress shirt and trousers also stepped up to the counter and said, "Are you really going to turn a soldier away for such a vague reason? We're talking about respect and justice, not ridiculous procedures." Meanwhile, Miller remained standing, his face unreadable. He didn't need to say anything else. Every word from the passengers around him was enough to send a loud message about the injustice he was facing. He could feel the strong support from the crowd. Suddenly, a man from the end of the line, graying hair and wearing a Marine Corps cap, stepped forward. He raised his head and looked straight at the employee, speaking firmly. "I'm a Marine. I've been through security checks at airports countless times, and I've never seen a soldier turned away like this. This is unacceptable." The airline employee didn't know how to respond. She was beginning to feel the pressure of all the eyes on her. The crowd was growing larger, and the voices of the passengers were growing louder. Phones were pointing toward her like a silent accusation. She realized that this situation couldn't be hidden any longer. All eyes were now on Miller, and the passengers standing up to defend him. The wall of silence had been shattered. This was no longer a personal issue. It had become a battle for the rights and respect of soldiers. And the longer this went on, the more those around realized they were witnessing a real fight, not on the battlefield, but in a crowded and chaotic airport. The tension in the airport had reached its peak. Phones were constantly recording the scene of Colonel Miller being denied boarding, despite being on a military mission. The small conversations around him grew louder. Murmurs from the crowd mixed with sharp criticism aimed at the airline. The situation quickly attracted the attention of surrounding passengers. and within minutes, the videos were uploaded to social media platforms. A young woman, with her hair tied up, holding a mobile phone, shared a live video on Facebook. She said, "We're at an airport, and a military officer is being denied boarding, just because of a vague policy reason. This needs to be addressed." Her post immediately caught the attention of thousands of people. Comments began flooding in from those who couldn't believe what they were witnessing. Within minutes, Twitter exploded with the hashtag #LetHimFly. Users from across the country began sharing the story, expressing outrage over the situation. One tweet from a veteran read, "Is this how we treat the people who protect our country? It's shameful." These tweets quickly received thousands of likes and retweets, turning this incident into a hot topic. The crowd around the counter began to swell. People who had not been part of the conversation earlier now stood up, pulled out their phones to record, and began criticizing the airline. People began to speak out about fairness and justice. This injustice could no longer be ignored. A woman in a red coat texted on her phone, "This company is dishonoring our soldiers. They need to be held accountable." The atmosphere around the counter had completely shifted. The story was no longer just a personal incident. It had become a nationwide issue. Veteran support groups began speaking up, calling for the airline to face consequences. Veterans organizations tweeted demands for an investigation into the incident, and just hours later, reporters from major news outlets began showing up at the airport. A CNN reporter approached the crowd and walked toward Miller. She asked earnestly, "Sir, could you share your thoughts on this situation? This story is making a lot of people upset." Miller didn't respond immediately, but turned back to look at the airline employee and said, "I don't need to say anything more. It's all been recorded, and everyone can see the injustice." Whispers continued to ripple through the crowd as passengers began looking toward the airline staff. It was clear that everyone understood this was much more serious than a routine check-in issue. The story was spreading on social media at lightning speed, and the airline could no longer ignore it. Everyone witnessing this knew the struggle wouldn't be easily resolved. But no one expected the situation to garner such widespread attention. After the media and online community turned their attention to the incident, the airline began to feel intense pressure from public opinion. Calls from military organizations, government agencies, and veterans groups flooded in. However, their efforts amounted to little more than disjointed apologies, not enough to quell the growing anger that was spreading everywhere. Then, at the peak of the tension, a man in uniform, Major Thomas Beckett, entered the airport. His presence was assured and serious. His eyes scanned the crowd before he walked toward the check-in counter. Major Beckett, a senior officer in the military, had been briefed about the incident. "Gentlemen, I'm Major Thomas Beckett from the Ministry of Defense. We've been informed about this incident, and we will resolve it right now." His voice was clear and firm, with no room for compromise. He turned to the airline employee, his tone commanding. "This matter will be addressed. Colonel Miller and the remains of Private First Class Jason Reynolds will not be flying commercial." "We will arrange a private flight for him." Major Beckett's arrival changed the situation instantly. The airline employee had no choice but to bow her head and apologize. They could do nothing further now that the military was involved. The crowd fell silent, realizing this was no longer just a personal matter. The military had intervened, and the situation had moved beyond the airline's control. Miller didn't appear satisfied with the resolution. He didn't need special treatment or a private flight. What he needed was respect. "I don't need a first-class flight," he said, his voice still steady. "I only need respect, and that's all I ask for." As Major Beckett led the way, Miller didn't look back. He had completed his mission, bringing the remains of a young soldier back to his family. No apology could heal the pain of those who had sacrificed their lives, but respect and justice had been served, and that was the only victory Miller cared about. Meanwhile, the airline faced severe consequences. Continuous criticism came from veterans organizations, media outlets, and the online community. The story not only harmed their reputation, but also sparked a strong wave of opposition. Ultimately, they were forced to issue a public apology and take action against the employees involved. However, these consequences could not be easily erased. This story didn't end with a special flight for Colonel Miller. It was a reminder of the importance of respect, justice, and community solidarity in the fight for what is right. Miller had fought not only for one soldier, but for all those serving their country, undeterred by hardship. In the end, Colonel James Miller completed his mission. After all the tension, confrontation, and the intervention of the military, he had brought the remains of Private First Class Jason Reynolds back to his family. No apology could make up for what had happened, but respect and justice had been served, and that was what mattered most. This story wasn't just about a military officer being denied boarding. It was about unity and the voice of the community. Thanks to the intervention of the passengers around him, the help of veterans, and the strong support on social media, the injustice could no longer continue. More importantly, we witnessed the power of community standing up to defend what is right. However, this is not the end. Each of us has a responsibility to speak up when we witness injustice. If you believe in respect and justice, leave your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know what you think about this situation and whether you've ever encountered something similar. Don't forget to hit like if you believe in the rights and respect for those who've served our country. And remember to subscribe to share these stories of courage and strength from those who protect justice. Let your voice be heard, because when we remain silent, injustice will continue. And next time there may not be anyone there to defend our soldiers.